Pablo Solon was formerly Bolivia's ambassador to the United Nations and Bolivia's chief negotiator on climate issues. He was also instrumental in organizing the World People's Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth, the 2010 gathering convened by Bolivian President Evo Morales to give the poor and the Global South an opportunity to respond to the failed climate talks in Copenhagen. That conference resulted in the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, a document that has no legal status yet, but has assumed great moral authority because it reflects in a profound and poetic way a comprehensive alternative vision of the earth and the human relationship with it. The society we need, Solon has written, is a new kind of society that is grounded on care for each other and nature, a society that seeks happiness for all and not profit for a few, a society based on a different concept of prosperity and well-being, a bio-society for life that includes humans and nature. Before his appointment as ambassador, Pablo Solon was a social activist, working with such organizations as indigenous movements, workers' unions, student associations, human rights, and cultural organizations in Bolivia. He is now the executive director of Focus on the Global South, based in Bangkok, Thailand. The first thing I want to say is thank you, and not thank you just for coming here today, but for all you've been doing over the last number of years. You've been I remember when Bolivia did not sign the consensus agreement at Cancun, and your explanation of it, and I thought, here is a strong and truthful voice, and that means a lot to a lot of us. So thank you very much for all of that. And if we had time, I would go back and if we do have time, maybe I will go back and talk about some of the work that you did subsequently with the indigenous rights, the Rights of Mother Nature Declaration, the People's Summit on Climate Change. But I think, given the shortness of the time and the situation that we're in, I had the impression that we had a real uptick in Ecuador and Bolivia a few years ago, and these were tremendous examples for the world. And it seems as though there's been a very strong pushback, not just here but worldwide. And do you agree with that? Has that been your experience?
In the case of Bolivia, the situation of indigenous people is not the same as it was before. There is a change. You have more participation. You have more indigenous people in the parliament, in the state itself. You have judges that are indigenous. That when it comes to civil and political rights, when it comes to the economy, now the gas and oil company has been nationalized. It's part of the state. The income of that company now doesn't go outside of the country as it was before. Now it stays in the country. And there are different kind of mechanisms to redistribute that to different sectors. Mechanisms for education, for health, for women. So there is a change also in the economy. And that is why these governments have a lot of support from popular sectors, because otherwise, if you would be right, the conclusion would be, oh, they don't have any support, they are as the previous governments, and so the reality is not that. So first thing, we must recognize that there is a change. Second thing, that there is in this change some elements that have benefited popular sectors. But it is true that if we put as a measure not the past, but the dream that we had, that is a different situation. It depends on what is the point of reference. In reference to the dream, this process have, I would say, I would not call them, they are post-neoliberalist. They are not any more neoliberal process. They are not neoliberal governments. But they are neo-developmentalist governments. They are not post-capitalist governments. They are still in the framework of capitalism. And they are very much focusing on how to develop, create more growth, economic growth, through extractive industries. In that sense, they have not gotten out of this paradigm that is basically based on the extraction from natural resources and the commodification of them. And the issue is that there was a dream, the dream of Buen Vivir, the dream of rights of Mother Earth, that was something different. It was something that was supposed to be post-capitalist, and that didn't happen, and that has not happened. In that sense, yes, there is here a problem. These governments have not moved into that direction. Why? I think that because they have begun to think on the re-election more than the long perspective. And if you want to be re-elected as a government, you need to have money in order to develop some popular mechanism that allow you to win support in the elections. Where do you get money fast? From extractive industries. So these governments have become very pragmatic. And they use extractivism because it's easier and faster to get the money in order to do these programs, in order to get support. And the rights of nature, the Buen Vivir, remains as a speech, as a discourse. And, of course, social movements, leaders, intellectuals that fought for this change, not in order to do just a change of from a high neoliberal to a post-developmentalism, but that really wanted a real change, are saying this is not the way. And then these governments began to react in a very authoritarian way. They don't want to hear, especially from the left, from the environmentalists, from the defenders of nature, that they have lost their track because they want to keep the image in relation to the population, to the international community. But the reality is that they are not really on the way to, hey, let's see how we implement the rights of nature, let's see how we move forward. No, that's absolutely not the case. And when some social movements, some leaders point this out, they try to shut down that kind of critique through different measures. So this process is a process that has lost its original roots. And now it's a process that has moved to state capitalism. And capitalism means violation of rights of nature, means growth that will destroy the planet. This is the problem.
Yeah, tell me about Buen Vivir, because that's not a concept I think that's widely known, certainly where I come from.
Well, Buen Vivir is a concept that comes from indigenous people in the Andean region. It means to live in harmony between humans and in harmony with nature in a community. The principle of Buen Vivir is you don't want to be better than the other. You just want to live well, have enough to solve problems of health, of education, of food, but not try to accumulate and have more and more. Because if you try to have more and more, you're going to end exploiting your neighbor and exploiting nature. So if we are going to seek harmony between humans and with nature, we have to stop trying to live better. We have to live well with what nature and what we can have in a community. That's, I would say, is the main philosophy, idea behind Buen Vivir. And of course, this is a model totally different than the capitalist system, because in the capitalist system, you always have to have more. The more you have, the more you are, and those things are measured on material things.
And it's your very firm belief that you cannot solve the ecological problem with a capitalist economy.
Yeah, because in the capitalist economy, you need to grow. Why you need to grow? Because capital needs to have a profit. A capital that doesn't have a profit is a capital outside of the market. So the capital will always try to seek forms to have a profit in order to increase the capital. The moment it stops doing that, it's out of the market, it's dead. So this is the logic of capital. Capital can operate through private companies, but can also operate through public companies, through the logic in the state. So it's not enough to distribute wealth. I can distribute wealth, but if one distributes the wealth and at the beginning people satisfy their basic needs and have access to communication, that is fine. But then if that means that new process of accumulation are going to begin, new process of concentration of wealth, we are repeating the same cycle again and again. That is why in this government, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Venezuela, you begin to see the emergence of a new type of bourgeoisie. It's different than the traditional. It's a new sector that not only has achieved the living well, but has achieved the living better and now wants to live even better. And in order to do that, wants to stay in power.
So this is a bourgeoisie within the public sector.
It's a bourgeoisie that the wealth they have comes from the public sector, but also from some sectors of the economy that have been not touched. Some private sectors. In the case of Bolivia, the big landowners. The big landowners have not been touched. The banking system has not been touched. It's a very capitalist, private-owned sector. And if you look at the data, the sector that has made more profits is the private banking sector. So there are some sectors that not only are the sectors of the new bourgeoisie, but also the old bourgeoisie that have increased their profits, their benefits.
So how do you, obviously if you're going to get to Buen Vivir, you're going to have to talk about large landowners, banking, the banking system, all of that. How do you get through that?
I think that in the case, for example, of Bolivia, we should have gone and do what we said that we were going to do. See what is the economic and social function of the land that is owned by these landowners and revert that land to the state. But that means that the government will have a conflict with this sector. And the government decided that in order to not have conflict, then they will postpone the analysis of the economic and social function of the land tenure. So when you are in the government, these sectors begin to do alliances with other sectors in order to stay in the power.
So to head off and make it impossible or very difficult to proceed with that sort of thing.
I don't get the
just that the sectors come together basically to stop the progress in the direction that you wanted in the first place.
Oh yes,
yeah.
of course.
Yeah, yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. When you talk about the land process, and this is not something I've heard much about or thought much about, but if the land were reverted to the state, would you be in danger of developing a kind of a Soviet, which is kind of a massive bureaucracy that owned all the land?
No, because then you have more land to give to peasants, indigenous communities, a lot of people that don't have land.
So that's what
I don't believe in the bureaucratic economy that at the end was developed in the Soviet Union. No, not at all. I think that a centralized authoritarian economy is not really going to succeed, and the Buen Vivir doesn't say that. It's the contrary. You have to have the communities, you have to have social democracy at the communal level, and they have to look for the resources that they have in the case of peasants, but also in the case of other sectors that are in the city, try to see how they live with what they have. Of course, the state has to support them, but has to promote a different vision, a vision that is not a vision of endless consumption. If you look at all this government, one campaign that you will not find is, hey, we need to consume less. Not even, we cannot have the paradigm of the rich countries. We have to have a different kind of paradigm. There is not a campaign, because in reality, they operate as capitalists. What do a capitalist economy wants? To have consumption. Because if there is a lot of consumption, then that will pull the economy. Even though that consumption can be a luxury consumption or can be a consumption that destroys nature, in the capitalist system, who cares? The problem is you have the possibility to sell more, and if you sell more, you have more profit. And that means capital realizes itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's a very close relationship between the social vision that you're describing, the Buen Vivir, and the local community sort of authority, and the environmental issues. Right? You're describing a way of living that would respect the rights of Mother Earth.
Yes, of course. But I must say that one thing that I also believe is that you cannot do Buen Vivir in Bolivia or in Ecuador or in any part in the world if you first don't deal with the international capital. Because let's say we do it, but you are not an island, you're in the world, and that world is dominated by a sea of economic laws and trade laws that are flowing through the logic of capital. So I think that small countries like Bolivia, like Ecuador, like others, have to implement some measures that will approach them to the Buen Vivir, but it will not be able to reach the Buen Vivir until you have changes in the key sectors of power of the global economy. I always have said the struggle, the fight for Buen Vivir, at the end will not be solved in Latin America. It will be solved in the key sectors of power: US, Europe, Japan, China. If we're not able to have movements, social movements that are strong there, these experiments will sooner or later face contradictions.
So then the next step would be to make those changes in the larger, at the global level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You need to have, therefore, you need to build a movement, a global social movement. And that is not easy, because actually what we are seeing is that there are a lot of movements, indignados, that uprise here and there by millions, but after a couple of days or weeks they go back to normality. We don't have the emergence of social movements that stay in time and that have some kind of organic of structure, that it has to be democratic, but there has to be some kind of structure. So the capitalist system is facing a lot of reactions, the Occupies and Indigenous here, Arab Spring, and so on. But still, that has not delivered a social movement that is globally organized. We have some seeds there, and I think we have to work a lot to put some of those seeds together. I think that in a very short term, maybe 1 decade, 2 the most, we're going to face a very deep crisis. We are in a systemic crisis. This is the crisis of the system, it's the Earth system that includes not only the climate, it includes the economy, it includes indigenous people, and because of what is happening with nature, we're going to have a chain reaction of natural disasters. What capital is doing to biodiversity is going to cause suddenly a shift, strong shift in the Earth system that will have huge implications for the access to water, for food, for forests. And as we are seeing now, but at a much larger scale, we're going to have different social movements reacting here and there. And for that moment, is necessary to build at least the seed, a core, the basis of a global movement. That is the key, and this battle will be solved at that level.
So if we come to the rights of nature, which we've been discussing for several days, is that one of the themes that can pull people together to prepare that basis that you're talking about?
I think that the movement needs to have the rights of nature. Why? Because in order to be a movement that's going to be alternative to the capitalist system, it has to be a movement that embraces a different kind of relation with Mother Earth. Because if it doesn't have that relation, it can be a very progressive social movement. But it will be, sooner or later, it will end with really no alternative to the capitalist system. A post-capitalist society, I don't see that it's possible to have one that is not really a society that embraces a new relation with nature, and in that sense that has the rights of nature, not as a discourse, but really as a guidance of all the steps that the society has to take, from the economy, from social policies, and so on.
Yes, and what you described a moment ago, because it is an Earth crisis, it can't be solved at less than an Earth level, right?
Exactly. But experience, that doesn't mean that experience like the Ecuador or Bolivia are not important, because they are in some way the examples that can reinvigorate this movement. That is why I am sad that the Ecuador example and the Bolivian example has not moved, deepening the implementation of rights of Mother Earth. I didn't expect to see the paradise of an ecological and social society in Bolivia in 5 years. No, that is not possible. And as I said before, it's not possible if we don't deal with the global context. But you can be an example in many aspects, taking the lead against GMOs, taking the lead in really defending indigenous people's rights, doing a strong redistribution of land, not embracing extractive industries. I understand that you cannot get rid of some extractive industries because you need resources, you need money, but you should not rely on incrementing, having more and more and more extractive industries. You should promote exactly the contrary. And then you become an example that can help this process of configuration of a global social movement that has a new kind of paradigm that is really post-capitalist.
Well, you know, in Bolivia and Ecuador have actually lit that fire to a considerable extent. I mean, I think people have been watching over the past few years and saying, oh, look at the way these guys are thinking. That's a way forward.
Exactly. But
that's why we're here.
Yeah, you know? that was so positive. Now the problem that we're facing is that, going back to your first question, is that suddenly these governments are showing that they are not really implementing that discourse, that there are many contradictions between what they say internationally and what they do nationally. And so this is not helping the development of the movement.
You actually wrote a letter to President Morales about that, didn't you? Saying we must do inside what we say we're doing outside.
Exactly.
What was the occasion? Remind me.
Oh, the occasion was the TIPNIS March. The government wanted to build a road through a national park that's called the TIPNIS, and indigenous people and many thought that, hey, why are you going to build a road that's going to destroy a national park where there's a lot of biodiversity? There is not really the need of that, and without any kind of consultation to the indigenous people and any kind of consultation to the Mother Earth, because I can understand that sometimes you need to do an infrastructure that will hurt Mother Earth. But in that case, you have to consult not only human, you have to consult Mother Earth. Look, is that the only way? Is it possible to build that road through a different way? Is it really essential? All of those things. But in this case, that didn't happen. And the saddest thing is that the indigenous people that were marching to La Paz suffered the repression. And well, that was the moment that I clearly sent that letter to President Morales.
Mm. And that's a moment I've heard from other Bolivians that it's kind of like that's the tipping moment when all of a sudden the government became a different government or revealed itself as a different government?
I think that the TIPNIS has played an important role. I think that until the TIPNIS there was a lot of expectation. After the TIPNIS things began to change. We had a law to respect the rights of Mother Earth, and then 1 year later, or a little bit more, a law of Mother Earth and integral development appear. And suddenly the rights of Mother Earth were not the main issue, but the main issue was development with a different name, not sustainable, but integral development. And that was the most important thing, and not really to preserve the rights of nature.
Mm-hmm. Can these governments recover their way, or have they done what they can do and we'll have to look to the future for something else?
Very difficult question. Something that it's not possible, something that it's still possible. I cannot speak for Ecuador. In the case of Bolivia, there are very strong social movements. It was a process that came from social movements. In that way, it's different than the case of Ecuador. So it's necessary to see how that is going to evolve. I would not say a final word at this moment, but I would definitely, I think that yes, it's possible that maybe there is no possibility to, as we say, to relaunch this process of change. Maybe what we need is to build a new process of change. We have to see.
Yes, because in a sense, once you spend your moral capital in the first term, and if you lose your way to any significant extent, very difficult to go back and get everybody fired up for something like Buen Vivir, if you've already done something that seemed to be running the other way.
Yeah, but you have to take into account that something is going to happen in the world too. You're going to have a deep systemic crisis of the earth. You're going to have economic crisis deepening. That is the case of Latin America. So those are going to act too. And then you're going to have a process of reflection. Some will say, hey, we have to continue. And some will say, no, hey, we have to see that we fail. Because what is happening at the end will end in a crisis in the case of Ecuador and Bolivia. Because in reality, it's not an option. It's more of the same. And we know that, yeah, sooner or later, that passes and you go back into those kind of economic crises that are part of the capitalist system, no?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes. So I find you here in Ecuador at the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, and you're now working with focus on the Global South, living in Thailand. I sort of sense that that you may feel that the energies that you have to contribute are better contributed now at an international level rather than as the representative of Bolivia in the international sphere?
Well, I cannot be the representative of Bolivia, of the government of Bolivia, if the government of Bolivia doesn't do what I'm saying at international level. So definitely that's not possible.
But that makes you a very unusual ambassador, because most ambassadors will represent their country no matter what, right? Canada now has a very right-wing government, and I haven't seen any ambassadors resigning. They just say, oh, this is the policy, right?
Well, yeah, but I'm not an ambassador of career. I'm a person that I think that when it comes to conscience, when it comes to principles, you have to follow your own beliefs, your own principles. I cannot be ambassador of the government if the government doesn't change its policy. No matter what. If the government is attacked by the imperialist forces, by right-wing forces, I would be the first to defend the government without being ambassador or any authority in the government. I would defend, because I think that right-wing forces, conservative forces, imperialist forces cannot rule and decide over Bolivia, definitely. But another thing is to be a representative of the government. Now, the other part of the question, I think, yes, that for me it has been a very important opportunity to live in Southeast Asia. In Focus on the Global South, we have offices in India and in the Philippines. So I was able to see a different reality. And that gives you a more global perspective. And sometimes to take some distance from your own reality helps you understand more your own reality. And that is what has happened. But I must say that my heart is always in Bolivia. So even though I work at the international level, and I love to do it, and I love to work with social movements in Asia, it reminds me very much to Bolivia in the 90s, when we were beginning to build social movements, confronting a very strong neoliberal government. No, it's a very difficult situation, but you see the energy, and I see the energy emerging little by little in Asia. And when they move, we're speaking about millions and hundreds of millions, and it's a very complex. It's not easy. But if you ask me, would I live outside the rest of my life? Definitely not.
Were you in the room when Cormac Cullinan said that we should be switching our allegiances from some of these abstractions like states and nations and so forth to places? That he said that's where our real human feeling is. It's not because there's lines on the map that say this is Bolivia. It's those people, that place, that language, that culture. That's where your heart is, right?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely, you're right. I don't believe in the borders, in the frontiers. They have been created in order to create national markets for capital. But I believe in being in the Andean region with my Illimani, my mountains, and the culture, the food. I realize now that, how much you like where you have lived almost all your life. So my roots are there. But I imagine a world with, the future world will not be a world with so many borders. The new world, if we are able to have a post-capitalist society, will not have these borders that you cannot go to the US, or you constrain the migration from certain populations. No, there has to be more solidarity. We have to have more big regions that are more in line with the ecosystems. Because if you want to live in harmony with the ecosystem, you cannot fragment, in many cases, that ecosystem in between countries that are occupying the same ecosystem, but just controlling a part of it. We have to look more at collective management of that, assuring the rights of Mother Earth in that ecosystem.
So in a sense, we're back to nature as the basis for human society, human politics, human relationships.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, when that takes us back to the indigenous world, which has never really lost that, right?
Yeah, the indigenous world has this relation with nature that we must always recover. I always say we have to go back to our roots. I also think that indigenous movements have to also learn from what is happening globally, from other movements, from the degrowth movement, from the deglobalization movement. I think I'm not a person that thinks, only this vision and this is the vision and it's the only vision. No, the Vivir Bien has to learn from the degrowth movement, and the degrowth movement from the Vivir Bien, and so on. We have to learn. All of these different alternatives have pieces, very important pieces for a new society, but not the whole picture. The whole picture is something that we have to build together from all of these different perspectives.
Somebody said to me at this global summit that we've been attending that one of the lovely features of it was that this was one of the very few occasions that she had seen indigenous people and non-indigenous people engaging without a lot of friction and tension, that they were basically focused on the same goals and were sharing very much between the two of them. Did you feel that?
Yeah. But I have seen that in many other occasions. I think that there are many indigenous movements in the world that are really defending their rights, and they know that they have to share their experience and learn from other experience. I think that you have more fights between indigenous people when you have some indigenous groups that have entered into the logic of the capitalist system, and they are just thinking in relation to their territory, but their territory for what is the profit, what is going to be the benefit that they are going to get from that territory. But this group of indigenous people that was here was an indigenous group that was not mainly focusing on what are our properties that belong to us indigenous, but how do we recover what is our most important value, that is this relation with nature that we have to preserve, share with others.
Now, one of the things that fascinated me about the Bolivian situation is that Bolivia calls itself, I think this is a wonderful phrase, the plurinational state of Bolivia. I think it's the only place we've ever heard a reference to that. But there was a whole component to the policy that had to do with a special autonomous an autonomy among the indigenous people. Can you tell me about that a little bit?
Well, the issue is that in Bolivia there are different indigenous peoples, nations. Aymaras, Quechuas, Guaranis, Mojeños, and they wanted to be recognized as nations. So when the constitution was being written, many said, oh no, if you recognize as nations, that means you're going to split the country in tiny states. And I think the constitution was a challenge, because then the agreement was, no, this is going to be a plurinational state. So one state that recognizes different nations. And so far, as we can see, Bolivia has not split in different indigenous nations, not at all, and they can live together. And I think it's very important. I think that the experience is something that is very good for other countries where there are different kind of nationalities or indigenous groups, that it's very good to recognize those different identities, cultures, and at the same time bring them together, and it is possible.
In practice, what does that actually mean on sort of in the lives of the people? If I'm in one indigenous nation and you're in another, what sorts of things would we be concerned with within our own nation and what within the state?
In the case of Bolivia? Well, in the case of Bolivia, in reality, it means that your language is respected, no? It means your authorities in your territory are respected. The way you govern your justice is respected, your practice, your country, your culture. So, but there has never been, in the case of Bolivia, a deep fight between indigenous groups that, oh no, this is my territory, you cannot come in. Of course, there has been battles between some indigenous groups that have happened, that are there for centuries of years, and some of them still continue. No, that doesn't have. Some of them have not been totally solved. It's not because you declare something in the constitution that immediately everything changed. But what it changed is that cultures that were marginalized suddenly feel, oh, we're recognized. We have our identity, and our identity is recognized, and that is very important.
We have a lot of control over the things that only affect us.
We have a lot of control, yes, but that is the problem when you have the overlap between the resources, for example, in the indigenous territories, and when indigenous people say, hey, we don't want to exploit them, and the government that says, no, I want to build a road or put there a mining, extractive mining industry, and so on. So then comes the tensions. and the tensions in Bolivia and also here in Ecuador is the state has to learn to respect the indigenous. And this has not happened totally in the case in these countries. Because when the state, the government decides one thing, and the indigenous people say, hey, we have not been consulted, and second, we are against that, governments, instead of saying, hey, sorry, let's do all process of consultation and I will respect you, they begin to say, no, we have to do it anyway, and try to find ways, some cases to divide those movements and so on.
So what you're describing sounds to me as though we have an idea of how to proceed, we take the steps that we can take, we then find that there's, as you say, tensions between those within that model, but you've got the model, you've started the model, you've got something to build on and something to progress from, and that's, as you were saying about some of the other things, that's a real achievement, isn't it?
It is an achievement, but as I said, our challenge is much more than that, because if we want to survive the next 50 years, we really need to go far beyond that. And that is what we need to do. So we can be happy about most of those things, but and we have to, but at the same time we have to not get tired and say, oh, okay, this is good, and
we'll stop here.
We'll stop here.
Yeah. I've wanted to interview Pablo Solon since December 2010, when he told the readers of The Guardian why Bolivia alone refused to endorse the comforting nonsense of the Cancun Climate Accord. Diplomacy, Solon wrote, is traditionally a game of alliance and compromise. Yet in the early hours of Saturday, 11th December, Bolivia found itself alone against the world. We were accused of being obstructionist, obstinate, and unrealistic. Yet in truth, we did not feel alone, nor are we offended by the attacks. Instead, we feel an enormous obligation to set aside diplomacy and tell the truth. Moral behavior requires courage, and courage is one of the things we look for when we select the people we want to interview. We find it in people as diverse as Vandana Shiva, one of the original tree huggers, or Frankie James, the Canadian artist whose response to intimidation by the Prime Minister was to excoriate the Prime Minister in public, or Betty Crodswick, the white-haired grandmother who spent years in prison for defending the British Columbia rainforest. 3 women. Isn't that interesting? You'll find them all on this site. For The Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron.